In 1802, a private company record in Wilmington quietly changed its legal language. No public announcement followed. Yet that single adjustment would allow one family name to pass through wars, crashes, and dissolutions without ever truly breaking. This video examines the Pont Dynasty and how its continuity was quietly engineered from the very beginning in Wilmington, Delaware. The short answer to the question in the title is this: the dynasty did not survive by chance. It was structured to endure. The first piece of evidence is a foundational corporate reclassification recorded in 1802, tied to the establishment of E.I. Dupont de Nemours and Coeur, a document that already reflects long-term custodial thinking rather than short-term enterprise. What follows will show how and why this early decision mattered, and how it shaped a legacy that appears uninterrupted even when history suggests it should not be. In the early 19th century, Wilmington, Delaware was not yet synonymous with industrial permanence. It was a river town positioned between older commercial centers, defined more by potential than by power. In 1802, against a backdrop of post-revolution uncertainty and fragile national institutions, a French-born immigrant named Eleuthère Irénée Dupont established a gunpowder manufactory along the Brandywine Creek. On paper, it was an industrial gamble. In practice, it became something more deliberate. The United States was still experimenting with its own economic identity. Banks failed often. Partnerships dissolved quietly. Family fortunes rose and collapsed within a generation. Yet the DuPont name would move through the 19th century with an unusual smoothness, surviving not only market cycles but also political realignments, technological shifts, and reputational risks that erased many of its contemporaries. What makes this continuity notable is not its scale, but its texture. When historians revisit the DuPont story, they often focus on innovation, chemistry, or patriotic supply during moments like the War of 1812. Those narratives are accurate, but incomplete. Behind the public image of invention and national service, the records reveal a parallel effort: the early construction of a system designed to outlive individuals. By the mid-1800s, American newspapers regularly referred to the DuPonts as a foundational industrial family, a phrase that carried both respect and assumption. The name appeared stable, reliable, almost administrative in nature. Yet stability itself was rare. The Panic of 1837 alone dismantled hundreds of firms that appeared just as solid on the surface. The tension, then, is not between success and failure, but between appearance and architecture. How does a family maintain continuity when the surrounding economic order does not? Why do certain names fragment across lawsuits, heirs, and dissolutions, while others seem to pass intact through time? This investigation does not begin with scandal or moral judgment. It begins with paperwork, with the language of stewardship, custody, and internal reorganization that appears early and repeats often. The question is not whether the DuPonts accumulated power, but how they governed it so quietly that it rarely registered as a choice at all. If a ledger, a trust clause, or a reclassification entry can shape a century, which record do you think mattered most? And if this line of inquiry holds your attention, subscribe so you don't miss the next file, and leave a like if the pattern itself intrigues you. What follows does not assume secrecy in the dramatic sense. It assumes intention. And the first trace of that intention sits in Wilmington, dated 1802, preserved in ink, and that is where the record begins. The first trace does not announce itself as a revelation. It appears the way institutional evidence often does, embedded in routine language, preserved because no one thought it necessary to dramatize it. In 1882, during a period when American industry was rapidly consolidating into trusts and holding structures, a set of corporate and estate records connected to the DuPont family begin to display a vocabulary that is notably out of place if read as family memory. The documents do not speak in the language of heirs, kinship, or lineage. They speak in the language of control. The year matters. By 1882, the United States was emerging from decades of economic volatility that had exposed how fragile personal ownership could be. Railroads collapsed, banks failed, and prominent surnames disappeared from ledgers almost overnight. Against this backdrop, E.I. Dupont de Nemours & Co. was no longer merely a manufacturing enterprise rooted in the Brandywine Valley. It was becoming an administrative organism. What surfaces in the records from this period is not a single dramatic contract, but a pattern. Repeated references to trustees, beneficial interests, fiduciary responsibility, restricted distributions, and deferred control. These terms appear across different classes of documents: corporate minutes, estate settlements, internal reorganizations, held today in institutional collections and archival repositories rather than private family albums. Their presence is not, in itself, illegal or unusual for the era. What makes them remarkable is their consistency and timing. They appear early, they repeat with minimal variation, and they are applied not to isolated assets, but to the structure of ownership itself. This is the first moment where the investigation shifts from biography to mechanism. The discovery is simple, but unsettling. The DuPont legacy, at least on paper, is already being treated less like an inheritance and more like an operating system. Distribution is not described as an emotional transfer between generations, but as a process that can be delayed, conditioned, or rerouted. Voting power is referenced separately from nominal ownership. Access is framed as something granted, not assumed. Even the word family appears less frequently than one would expect, replaced by neutral, almost sterile administrative language. There is no flourish in these records. No explanation is offered for why such structures are necessary. The documents do not justify themselves. They assume acceptance. That assumption is the first anomaly. In an era when wealth was still publicly defended as the product of individual merit or industrial daring, these papers quietly reframe continuity as a matter of governance. The implication is subtle but profound. Permanence is no longer a personal achievement but a managed outcome. The concrete action here is not hidden, it is recorded. Legal interests are reclassified. Control is separated from enjoyment. Authority is placed into custodial hands designed to outlast any single bearer of the name. The consequence is equally concrete. From this point forward, the DuPont name becomes insulated from the most common points of failure that dismantled other dynasties: contested estates, forced liquidations, internal disputes visible to courts and press. What this discovery does not do is accuse. It does not claim conspiracy or moral failure. It simply establishes that something exists which, by its nature, resists the idea of family history as a natural story. When a legacy is written primarily as contract, sentiment becomes secondary to structure. Memory yields to procedure. By the end of the 1880s, newspapers would increasingly describe the DuPonts as stable, enduring, almost inevitable. That perception rests on a foundation few readers ever saw. The records did not disappear. They persisted quietly, preserved by the very institutions designed to protect continuity. They survived because they were useful. The tension left unresolved is not what these documents prove, but what they displace. If stewardship replaces inheritance at the very beginning of consolidation, what exactly is being passed down, and what is being held in reserve? The paper trail does not answer that question yet. It only leaves behind an image, a ledger page where a name remains unchanged, even as the meaning of ownership beneath it has already been rewritten. By 1890, permanence itself had become a liability. What had once been admired as industrial strength was now increasingly described as excess, dominance, or threat. The United States was no longer simply expanding. It was beginning to interrogate the forces that had shaped that expansion. Large concentrations of capital, especially when tied to recognizable family names, entered a new phase of public scrutiny. For families like the DuPont family, the danger was no longer market collapse alone, but visibility. The timing is critical. The late 19th century marked a turning point in how power was discussed in the American press and in political discourse. By 1890, antitrust legislation was no longer theoretical. Congressional debates, editorials, and investigative reporting increasingly framed industrial dynasties as entities that required containment. The passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act that same year formalized a shift already underway. Economic success could now be recast as a public risk. Scale invited attention. Continuity invited suspicion. This was not an abstract concern. Newspapers of the period regularly published exposés on monopolies, trusts, and industrial empires, often naming families directly. Reputation became fragile. A surname that once signaled reliability could quickly become shorthand for excess. In this environment, inheritance itself was politicized. Who controlled assets, how long they controlled them, and through what mechanisms became matters of public interest rather than private arrangement. Elite families responded by adjusting how they appeared to function. The visible story emphasized professionalism, decentralization, and managerial distance. Behind that facade, structures were refined to ensure that control could persist without appearing personal. Holdings multiplied. Boards and trustees interposed themselves between names and decisions. Language shifted from ownership to administration. The goal was not secrecy in the dramatic sense, but insulation. This is where the context clarifies the earlier evidence. The trust language that surfaced in the 1880s did not emerge in a vacuum. By 1890, it functioned as a defensive architecture. Power that could be attacked as familial was safer when described as fiduciary. Authority that might provoke moral outrage was less volatile when framed as procedural necessity. The action taken during this period was not a single legal maneuver, but a sustained reclassification of how control was described and exercised. The risk being managed was multidimensional. Legally, concentrated ownership invited regulation. Socially, it attracted resentment. Politically, it threatened alliances. Even internally, visible succession disputes could invite external intervention. Families learned that continuity required more than wealth. It required a vocabulary that deflected scrutiny. The separation of family from control became a survival strategy rather than a philosophical choice. The consequence of this adaptation was significant. Dynasties that successfully translated personal power into institutional form weathered the period with fewer disruptions. Their names remained present, but less exposed. Their influence continued, but appeared diffuse. What looked like stability from the outside was, in fact, constant adjustment beneath the surface, an effort to align permanence with the expectations of a society increasingly hostile to overt dominance. Importantly, this does not imply inevitability. Many industrial families failed to adapt and paid the price. Court battles, forced breakups, and reputational collapse were common outcomes for those whose structures remained too transparent or too personalized. The lesson. Absorbed by the surviving elite was pragmatic. Visibility was a vulnerability. By the end of the 19th century, an impenetrable system no longer reads as paranoia when placed against this backdrop. It reads as calibration. The architecture of continuity was not built because families expected wrongdoing to be uncovered, but because the very fact of enduring power had become suspect. To last, power needed to look ordinary, administrative, almost dull. This context reframes the investigation. What might appear excessive in isolation becomes intelligible when situated within an era that punished prominence. The records from this period show a deliberate effort to align legacy with governance and governance with legitimacy. That alignment carried costs, opacity, distance, silence, but it also delivered protection. As the century closed, the DuPont name remained intact, even as the rules governing industrial America shifted dramatically. The risk had been acknowledged, addressed, and absorbed into structure. What remains unresolved is how far that logic extended and what was quietly altered to maintain it. The next trace is not dramatic. It is smaller, more precise, a value reclassified, preserved on paper, waiting to be noticed. In 1903, the question was no longer whether continuity could be preserved, but whether it could be removed from the realm of individual judgment altogether. By that year, the DuPont family had already lived through enough volatility to understand that informal understandings and personal authority were liabilities. What appears in the surviving records from this period is not debate, but resolution, a shift from reliance on people to reliance on procedure. The setting of this decision matters. At the turn of the 20th century, large American fortunes were undergoing a quiet but profound transformation. Boards, legal counsel, and trustees were no longer peripheral advisors. They were becoming the core through which power was exercised. In 1903, within the corporate and patrimonial orbit of E.I. Dupont de Nemours & Co., governance begins to look deliberately standardized. Internal memoranda, minutes, and reorganizational filings reflect a common direction. Succession would no longer be negotiated case by case. This was an internal intervention, not a public one. There is no press announcement marking the change, no celebratory language about modernization. Instead, the evidence suggests a controlled moment inside closed rooms where trustees, senior executives, legal advisors, and the core family members with decisive authority aligned around a single premise. Continuity should be designed, not inherited. The language used is administrative and restrained. Rights are not taken away, they are redefined. Authority is not centralized, it is consolidated. Heirs are not excluded, they are buffered. The concrete action taken in this period is visible in the structure itself. Voting control is reorganized so that influence over strategic decisions no longer tracks directly with nominal ownership. Intermediate entities are created to sit between individuals and assets, insulating both sides. Succession pathways are standardized, replacing discretion with rules. The posture of the organization changes from reactive to anticipatory. Potential disputes are addressed before they can surface. What is striking is the breadth of authorization behind this move. It is not imposed unilaterally by lawyers, nor dictated solely by family elders. The records indicate alignment across institutional layers: board approval, legal validation, and familial consent. This convergence matters because it transforms what might otherwise be contested into something procedural. Once embedded, the decision does not need to be defended repeatedly. It simply operates. The consequence of this shift is immediate and durable. Power ceases to depend on the temperament, competence, or survival of specific individuals. It becomes portable across generations without renegotiation. The system can absorb death, disagreement, and even public controversy without forcing a structural reckoning. From a legal standpoint, this reduces exposure. From a financial standpoint, it preserves coherence. From an institutional standpoint, it renders the family name less relevant than the framework carrying it. This moment also clarifies why earlier trust language appeared so early and so consistently. Those documents were not provisional experiments, they were precursors. By 1903, the logic underlying them is no longer tentative. It is formalized. The family is repositioned as one component within a governed system rather than the system itself. This distinction is subtle, but decisive. It allows continuity to be framed as stewardship rather than dominance. The cost of this decision is not recorded in emotional terms, but it is implicit. Personal discretion yields to policy. Individual narratives are subordinated to institutional memory. Silence becomes a feature rather than a flaw. The weight of the inheritance shifts, not lighter, but more distant. What is preserved is not intimacy, but durability. This block advances the investigation because it identifies the precise moment where intention becomes architecture. Before this point, continuity could still be interpreted as habit or tradition. After 1903, it reads as design. The choice has been made, documented, and implemented in ways that do not call attention to themselves. What remains unresolved is how this design expressed itself in smaller, less visible ways. Once procedure governs succession, certain elements inevitably fall away, details deemed non-essential to operation. The next trace does not announce a new policy. It appears as an absence, a line removed, a reference no longer carried forward. The image left behind is quiet and precise. A voting right reclassified, noted once in ink, then never mentioned again. What becomes visible after 1903 is not another decision, but the effect of a decision already absorbed. Once continuity is formalized as procedure, the system begins to express itself through what it no longer requires. The records thin out. Language becomes narrower. Where earlier documents explained purpose, later ones assume it. This shift is subtle, but it is measurable in the way internal references change over the following years. In the period immediately after 1903, correspondence and filings linked to the DuPont family increasingly rely on standardized phrases that no longer point to individual judgment. Terms like exception, special arrangement, or temporary provision recede. In their place appear neutral formulations that imply permanence, standing rules, fixed procedures, default restrictions. The system no longer needs to justify itself because it has become the baseline. This is where absence begins to matter as much as presence. Earlier generations left behind marginal notes, contextual explanations, even traces of disagreement. After professionalized governance takes hold, those signals diminish. Discretionary commentary is quietly omitted from minutes. Succession references are shortened, reduced to compliance language, rather than narrative description. The change is not dramatic enough to provoke attention, but it is consistent enough to suggest intent. The action here is not additive, but subtractive. Explanatory layers are removed. The structure is simplified for internal use, even as it grows more complex in operation. This has a practical effect. Fewer points of interpretation mean fewer opportunities for challenge. Ambiguity is replaced by routinization. Decisions that might once have required discussion are now executed automatically. The consequence of this evolution is a further distancing of power from personality. Even within the family, access to the logic of control becomes mediated. Heirs interact with outcomes rather than mechanisms. They inherit positions within a framework whose foundations predate them and whose rules are no longer negotiable. From the outside, this looks like stability. From the inside, it functions as containment. This extension matters because it explains why later observers struggle to locate moments of intervention. The intervention has already succeeded. Once governance is normalized, its operation leaves fewer fingerprints. What remains are clean surfaces, orderly records, consistent language, an appearance of inevitability. The absence of conflict in the archive is not proof of harmony, it is evidence of filtration. By the time the system reaches maturity, silence itself has been institutionalized, not through secrecy agreements or explicit suppression, but through design choices that render certain questions irrelevant. If authority is procedural, motive no longer needs to be articulated. If succession is standardized, preference no longer needs to be recorded. The record becomes thinner precisely because the system is working as intended. This prepares the ground for what follows. When historians or regulators later search for points of leverage, they encounter a structure that appears complete, self-referential, and resistant to narrative intrusion. The most telling signs are not dramatic conflicts, but missing explanations. Lines that once carried context are no longer there. Names that might have appeared as decision-makers are absent, replaced by institutional placeholders. The investigation advances here by narrowing its focus. The question is no longer how continuity was designed, but what had to be removed to make that design function smoothly. The next trace will not be found in a resolution or charter. It will be found in something that quietly stopped appearing. A reference dropped, a role dissolved, a detail deemed unnecessary to preserve. The image that closes this extension is restrained but precise. A page number skipped in a bound volume, the sequence intact, the omission unremarked. signaling that the system has learned exactly what it no longer needs to say. In 1915, the change does not announce itself as a rupture. There is no scandal, no public dispute, no visible crisis forcing intervention. What survives instead is a revision, quiet, technical, and decisive, embedded in the fiduciary and governance structure surrounding the DuPont family. By this point, continuity is no longer a question of intent. It is a matter of maintenance. And maintenance, unlike ambition, leaves a paper trail that looks deliberately unremarkable. The year matters because it marks the full transition into 20th century legal architecture. By 1915, inheritance among elite American families is no longer treated primarily as a domestic affair. It is an engineering problem. Courts, regulators, and financial institutions have matured enough to recognize fragmentation as risk, not only to families, but to markets. Within that environment, the DuPont system undergoes a recalibration that is subtle in appearance but profound in effect. The alteration appears across revised trust terms, updated bylaws, and settlement language that no longer tolerates ambiguity. Earlier instruments allowed room for interpretation, discretionary distributions, negotiated voting arrangements, situational exceptions. The revised structure tightens those margins. Terms are rewritten to reduce exposure to division. Control is explicitly separated from enjoyment. Income streams are decoupled from authority. Nominal ownership is reclassified so that it carries recognition without leverage. This is not a single document, but a coordinated adjustment. Fiduciary language becomes more assertive. Trustees and committees are no longer described as stewards acting on behalf of named individuals, but as decision-makers acting within defined mandates. The locus of authority shifts again, not away from the family entirely, but away from any one branch, personality, or moment. Decision-making is embedded in process. The concrete action taken in 1915 is therefore architectural. Assets are reorganized into categories that behave differently under stress. Some generate income but confer no voice. Others carry voting power but restrict access to cash flow. Certain holdings are placed behind additional layers of approval, ensuring that liquidation, disclosure, or redistribution cannot occur without institutional consensus. What looks, on the surface, like modernization is in fact fortification. The effect of this alteration is measurable in 3 dimensions. First, who decides? Authority is consolidated in fiduciary bodies whose continuity does not depend on bloodline alone. Second, who receives? Beneficiaries are positioned to draw value without shaping strategy. Third, who can speak? The right to represent the legacy externally is narrowed, managed, and, in some cases, removed entirely from individual heirs. The family remains visible, but selectively so. The consequence of this shift is not immediate drama, but long-term opacity. As inheritance becomes architecture, the family story thins. Public narratives simplify. Complexity retreats into governance documents rarely consulted outside professional circles. The system becomes legible only to those trained to read it. For historians and observers, this creates an illusion of smooth continuity. Names persist, assets remain intact, disputes are scarce. What disappears? Here is not wealth, but texture. Personal agency yields to compliance. Internal variation is absorbed rather than expressed. The alteration does not erase people, but it limits their capacity to alter outcomes. From a legal perspective, this reduces risk of challenge. From a financial perspective, it preserves scale. From an institutional perspective, it ensures that continuity survives even when family dynamics change. This block advances the investigation because it identifies the moment when inheritance stops behaving like inheritance at all. After 1915, the DuPont legacy functions less as a transmission of property and more as a controlled environment. The silence that follows is not accidental. It is produced by design choices that reward predictability and penalize deviation. The cost of this alteration is not recorded in numbers. It is borne in distance between heirs and authority. Distance between name and control. Distance between history as lived and history as archived. What remains is a structure capable of absorbing pressure without revealing its internal logic. The unresolved tension lies in what this structure excludes. When rules are rewritten to prevent fragmentation, certain forms of participation necessarily fall away. Certain voices become redundant. Certain details are no longer preserved because they are no longer operationally relevant. The next trace will not be found in a new clause or committee. It will be found in something that no longer appears at all. The image that closes this alteration is precise and restrained. A trust schedule amended in 1915, a column of assets reclassified, the totals unchanged, only the permissions altered, leaving the legacy intact and the story harder to reach. What follows the 1915 alteration is not another rewrite, but a stabilization phase in which the new architecture proves its usefulness by reducing the need for further intervention. The records from the years immediately after no longer debate structure. They apply it. References to governance appear shorter, more procedural, and increasingly detached from explanation. The system, once adjusted, begins to operate with minimal narrative footprint. In this period, materials associated with the DuPont family show a noticeable shift in emphasis. Instead of redefining authority, documents focus on compliance with existing frameworks. Trustees act within predefined bounds. Committees reference mandates rather than intent. Even when assets change form, sold, merged, or reallocated, the language describing those actions defers to rules already in place. The alteration of 1915 has removed the need to argue. What remains is execution. The action that matters here is quiet reinforcement. Reporting standards are tightened. Cross-references replace explanation. Where earlier filings described rationale, later ones simply cite prior provisions. This creates a chain of dependency that is difficult to unwind, to question a present action. One must trace it back through layers of earlier authorization. Over time, that trail becomes technically accessible but practically opaque. The consequence is cumulative. Each application of the revised structure further normalizes it. What began as a legal adjustment becomes an assumption embedded in daily administration. New participants, advisors, executives, even heirs, enter a system whose logic predates them. They inherit outcomes, not choices. The architecture shapes behavior, without requiring consensus at every step. This extension matters because it explains how alterations endure without continual defense. Once embedded, the structure begins to filter what is recorded. Issues that fall outside its parameters are not debated. They are simply excluded from formal consideration. The archive narrows, not through censorship, but through relevance. Only actions compatible with the system generate documentation. From the outside, this produces a sense of inevitability. Observers see continuity without conflict and assume harmony. Internally, however, that appearance is sustained by constraints that limit variation. The alteration succeeds precisely because it reduces the range of possible outcomes. Disputes do not vanish. They fail to reach the level where they would require structural response. The cost of this phase is subtle but lasting. As governance becomes self-referential, history becomes harder to reconstruct. Decisions reference procedures that reference earlier procedures until motive dissolves into precedent. What is preserved is function, not memory. The system remembers what it needs to operate and forgets the rest. This prepares the investigation for its next movement. If alteration reshapes authority, the natural next question is what, or who, falls away as a result. Stabilized systems do not just preserve, they exclude by design. The next trace will not involve rewriting rules, but observing what no longer qualifies to be recorded under them. The image that closes this extension is restrained and concrete. A routine compliance report filed years after 1915, accurate in every requirement, complete in every formality, yet offering no hint of the human negotiations that once surrounded inheritance. confirming that the alteration has fully taken hold. By 1921, the effects of the earlier alterations are no longer theoretical. They are visible in outcomes. The war has ended, new fortunes are emerging, old ones are under. Pressure and inheritance across the American elite has become a contested space. Against this backdrop, the DuPont family does not fragment, litigate, or publicly renegotiate itself. It consolidates quietly. The question this block answers is not how the system was built, but who it ultimately served. The first group to benefit is the core line of heirs positioned closest to institutional control. These individuals do not necessarily receive more money in a simple sense. What they retain is something less visible and more durable: proximity to decision-making. In the post-1915 structure, access to voting mechanisms, committee influence, and agenda setting is unevenly distributed. Certain heirs inherit income streams without authority, while others inherit authority with limited direct exposure. The silence surrounding this arrangement is not accidental. It prevents internal hierarchy from becoming external narrative. The second beneficiaries are the trustees themselves. By 1921, trusteeship within DuPont-associated structures has evolved from custodial obligation into operational power. Trustees approve distributions, manage timing, interpret mandates, and mediate between family branches and institutional entities. Their role is no longer passive. It is executive in all but name. The concrete action visible in the records is the expansion of trustee discretion, codified through amendments that allow interpretation within predefined limits. This discretion is rarely exercised publicly, but it shapes outcomes consistently. What trustees gain is stability and authority without visibility. They are insulated from public scrutiny precisely because they operate through process rather than personality. Their power does not need defense because it is embedded. The consequence is an internal governance class whose continuity rivals that of the family itself. Individuals may change, but the role persists, carrying institutional memory forward even as family memory thins. The third beneficiaries are the institutions linked to the DuPont name. By the early 1920s, these include not only corporate entities, but also funds, boards, and philanthropic structures that function as extensions of the legacy. These institutions benefit from predictability. Mission statements remain intact. Endowments are protected from sudden reallocation. Reputational risk is minimized because decisions appear procedural rather than personal. The name becomes a stabilizing asset, rather than a point of vulnerability. The action that reveals this benefit is administrative rather than symbolic. Voting rights are allocated in ways that privilege institutional continuity over individual preference. Access to records is tiered. Certain participants receive reports without context, others context without leverage. The distribution of benefit is not equal, but it is orderly. Those closest to the system's core are rewarded with influence. Those further out are rewarded with security. The real consequence of this arrangement is a transformation in what the dynasty represents. It ceases to function primarily as a wealthy family and begins to operate as an infrastructure of power. Wealth flows through it, but does not define it. Authority resides within it, but is not easily traced to a single figure. Reputation adheres to the structure rather than the individuals moving through it. This is where silence becomes an asset. By avoiding public disputes, visible succession battles, or competing narratives, the system protects all beneficiaries simultaneously. Heirs avoid scrutiny, trustees avoid exposure, institutions avoid disruption. Each group gains something different, but all gain from the same condition: the absence of noise. Importantly, this does not mean there are no internal tensions. It means those tensions are resolved below the threshold of record. The archive shows outcomes without debate, decisions without dissent, benefits without explanation. The lack of controversy is not proof of consensus. It is evidence of filtration. Only what aligns with continuity survives documentation. This block advances the investigation by clarifying motive without resorting to accusation. The system persists because it rewards those positioned to sustain it. Silence is not merely protective, it is distributive. It allocates power efficiently by preventing challenges from becoming legible. What remains unresolved is the cost borne by those outside this beneficiary circle. When power consolidates, exclusion follows, not through expulsion, but through irrelevance. Certain voices stop appearing. Certain claims lose standing. Certain stories are no longer recorded because they no longer affect outcomes. The image that closes this block is concrete and restrained. A 1921 trustee report approving distributions and governance appointments, compliant in every respect, naming no dissent, recording no conflict, yet clearly showing that control, once dispersed among family members, now rests firmly within an institutional frame that benefits a select few and leaves others quietly outside its margins. What becomes clearer after 1921 is not an expansion of benefit, but its stabilization. Once advantages distributed to those aligned with the structure, the system no longer needs to reward overtly. It only needs to maintain position. In the years that follow, documentation tied to the DuPont family reflects this shift. Benefits are no longer described as outcomes. They are assumed conditions, embedded so deeply that they stop being named. This phase reveals an important distinction. The greatest beneficiaries are not necessarily those who appear most prominent in public accounts, but those whose roles persist without scrutiny. Operational authority, once concentrated, begins to reproduce itself through appointment patterns rather than inheritance. Trustees recommend successors who resemble themselves in function rather than lineage. Committees perpetuate their own logic by selecting participants fluent in procedure, not personality. Over time, advantage becomes self-renewing. The action that defines this stage is selective access. Certain heirs and administrators gain proximity to internal deliberation, while others receive only finalized outcomes. This is not recorded as exclusion. It appears as efficiency. Minutes shorten. Justifications disappear. Decisions reference prior approvals that are no longer elaborated. The benefit here is subtle but decisive. Those inside the loop shape the future. Those outside adjust to it. The consequence is a narrowing of relevance. Participation becomes conditional on alignment with institutional priorities. Voices that might challenge direction do not need to be silenced. They simply fail to meet the criteria required to influence process. Over time, this produces an internal culture where continuity feels natural to those who benefit from it and opaque to those who do not. Another beneficiary emerges indirectly, the public narrative itself. By minimizing visible conflict, the dynasty presents an image of cohesion that attracts trust from partners, regulators, and associated institutions. Stability becomes reputational capital. The absence of dispute is interpreted as competence. This perception reinforces the system, drawing external confidence inward and converting it into further insulation. This extension matters because it shows how benefit evolves from reward into environment. Once silence proves useful, it is no longer managed actively. It is preserved passively. Participants adapt their behavior to avoid friction. Administrators frame choices within acceptable parameters. Even dissent, when it occurs, is redirected into channels that do not threaten structure. The system does not suppress disagreement, it absorbs it. The cost of this arrangement is cumulative and largely invisible, as benefits solidify alternative paths. Narrow. Those who might have reshaped the legacy instead inherit fixed roles within it. Innovation becomes incremental. Change occurs only when it reinforces stability. The dynasty's strength grows, but its internal diversity contracts. This prepares the investigation for its next movement. When benefit becomes normalized, its boundaries become harder to see. Advantage persists not because it is defended, but because it is no longer questioned. The next trace will not involve gain, but loss, not of wealth, but of presence. Something will stop appearing, not because it was removed forcefully, but because the system no longer has use for it. The image that closes this extension is restrained and telling. A routine appointment cycle completed years after 1921. The same names circulating through governance roles, the same procedures reaffirmed, no objections recorded, signaling that benefit has settled into permanence, and that silence has become not just protective, but habitual. In 1934, the change is not registered as a decision, nor even as a reform. It is registered as an absence. As the United States enters an era of aggressive public review of capitalism, banking inquiries, securities regulation, renewed attention to ownership and influence, names begin to matter more than structures. And in that moment, something subtle but consequential occurs within the orbit of the DuPont family. Individual presence recedes, while institutional form advances. The year is critical. By 1934, the aftermath of the Great Depression has transformed public tolerance for concentrated power. Investigative journalism, federal oversight, and regulatory filings increasingly demand clarity about who controls what. Direct associations between individuals and authority become points of vulnerability. In this environment, the system built over the previous decades responds not by defending its actors, but by reducing their visibility. The first element to disappear is the obvious one: personal names. Where earlier records listed individuals as directors, decision-makers, or controlling parties, newer public-facing documents substitute entities. Boards reference holding companies. Committees are identified by mandate rather than membership. Trusteeship is attributed to offices or custodial roles instead of people. The action is concrete and verifiable. Names are removed from formal positions and replaced with institutional placeholders. This does not mean control is relinquished. It means it is translated. Authority migrates from persons to structures designed to persist without attribution. Holdings intermediaries multiply, creating layers between decision and disclosure. Ownership chains lengthen. What was once a visible line becomes a network of references that requires specialized knowledge to trace. The disappearance is bureaucratic, not dramatic. No one is expelled. No title is publicly revoked. The record simply changes shape. Another element recedes. Quietly, direct linkage. Earlier documents allowed an attentive reader to connect family members to specific levers of influence. By the mid-1930s, those connections are obscured. Filings show compliance without context. Reports satisfy regulatory thresholds while offering minimal relational detail. Correspondence that once circulated within mixed channels is now archived separately, categorized as private or internal, placed beyond routine access. The paper survives, but its availability does not. The concrete action here is omission. Certain references are no longer carried forward. Certain relationships are no longer named. Certain explanations are no longer required because the system has learned how to meet scrutiny with form rather than substance. The person disappears. The entity appears. Control survives, but its outline softens. The consequence is immediate and durable. For the public reader, tracing influence becomes significantly harder. The absence of names suggests decentralization, even when decision-making remains concentrated. Regulators encounter structures that appear compliant and impersonal. Journalists confront filings that satisfy disclosure rules without revealing hierarchy. The system does not resist oversight. It accommodates it while withholding legibility. This disappearance also alters internal dynamics. Individuals who once embodied authority become interchangeable within roles. Succession becomes less about recognition and more about placement. Memory of who decided what and when fades faster because it is no longer anchored to a person. Institutional continuity strengthens precisely as personal trace weakens. Importantly, nothing in this process requires secrecy in the classic sense. There is no evidence of mass destruction or explicit concealment. The disappearance is procedural. It emerges from choices about how to classify, how to report, how to name or not name. Over time, these choices accumulate into a landscape where control is real but diffuse, exercised but hard to attribute. This block advances the investigation by shifting attention from what was built to what was removed. Earlier topics showed how continuity was engineered. Here we see how it was protected when exposure became dangerous. The system adapts by subtracting visibility, not authority. The tension that remains unresolved is structural. When names vanish from records, accountability changes shape. Responsibility becomes harder to assign, not because it no longer exists, but because it is distributed across entities that speak in neutral language. The archive grows cleaner but thinner. What is lost is not data, but traceability. The image that closes this disappearance is restrained and unmistakable. A 1934 public filing where a familiar surname once appeared, now replaced by the name of a holding entity. No explanation offered, no justification required, leaving control intact, and the human hand behind it just out of reach. After 1934, the disappearance no longer unfolds as an event. It settles into a condition. Once names have been removed from the most exposed surfaces of governance, the system begins to behave as though they were never necessary in the first place. Subsequent records linked to the DuPont family do not acknowledge a transition, they assume one. The absence becomes structural, not transitional. In the years that follow, public documentation increasingly relies on abstract identifiers. Authority is referenced through offices, mandates, and custodial capacities rather than individuals. Even when leadership changes internally, the outward-facing language remains static. The same entities persist. The same intermediaries appear. Continuity is communicated through repetition of form, not through disclosure of actors. This creates a surface of stability that resists historical probing. The action that defines this phase is administrative substitution, where earlier eras replaced people with entities. This period replaces explanation with reference. Filings point to prior filings. Reports cite established structures without restating their composition. Over time, this creates a closed informational loop. To understand the present, one must access earlier records. To understand those, one must know where to look. For most observers, the trail effectively ends. The consequence is a shift in how power is perceived. Control no longer looks concentrated because it no longer looks personal. The removal of names diffuses attention. Responsibility appears shared, procedural, almost accidental. This has legal and reputational effects. Questions directed at institutions are answered by policy. Questions about individuals are redirected to structure. Accountability is not denied. It is rerouted. Internally, this disappearance reshapes behavior. Participants learn that visibility is not rewarded. Influence is exercised quietly, through alignment with process rather than assertion of role. Those who adapt remain relevant. Those who seek recognition fade from the operational core. Over time, the system selects for administrators rather than personalities. Memory becomes institutional rather than biographical. This extension matters because it shows how disappearance sustains itself. Once names are no longer required to legitimize authority, reintroducing them would create unnecessary exposure. Silence becomes the default, not because of fear, but because of efficiency. The system operates more smoothly when it does not need to explain itself. The archival effect is subtle, but profound. Later historians encounter a landscape where influence is evident in outcome, but elusive in attribution. Decisions can be traced to entities that no longer correspond neatly to people. The question shifts from who decided to under what framework did this occur. In that shift, human agency recedes from view. This prepares the investigation for its next step. When disappearance becomes routine, it creates conditions for something else to emerge. Inconsistencies, gaps between records, small misalignments that surface precisely because the system no longer expects close reading. The next trace will not announce itself as loss, but as something that does not quite align. A date, a figure, a reference that fails to match its surroundings. The image that closes this extension is restrained and concrete. A late 1930s governance document impeccably formatted. Fully compliant, naming no individual authority at all, only roles, entities, and procedures, confirming that disappearance is no longer an action, but a settled state. In 1942, the record presents something it has avoided for decades, a contradiction that cannot be smoothed by language alone. The public story still speaks in familiar terms: family legacy, continuity, stewardship across generations. But the documents no longer behave as if that story were sufficient. They behave like infrastructure. Under stress, the inconsistency does not announce itself loudly. It appears as a cold point in the archive, a place where form and narrative stop aligning. The year matters. 1942 is not just another administrative checkpoint. It sits inside a period of extraordinary pressure. Wartime production, federal oversight, strategic materials, and heightened scrutiny converge. Governance structures across American industry acquire additional layers, often justified as temporary or precautionary. Within the orbit of the DuPont family, those layers appear with a familiarity that suggests rehearsal rather than reaction. The first inconsistency surfaces in timing. Records show reorganizations and internal adjustments that coincide precisely with moments of public or market pressure, yet are described as routine. Dates align too neatly. A restructuring filed in 1942 mirrors earlier adjustments made under different crises, using nearly identical language. Continuity, if natural, would not require such punctual reinforcement. The repetition suggests calibration, not inheritance. A second fault line appears in valuation and participation. Certain asset classifications shift during this period without any corresponding public explanation. Percentages move. Voting weight is redistributed. Control mechanisms tighten. Yet the outward narrative remains unchanged. There is no announcement of transformation, no acknowledgement that anything meaningful has occurred. The numbers change, but the story does not. This mismatch is not illegal, but it is revealing. It implies that narrative has become decoupled from operation. The third inconsistency is found in attribution. Signatures appear that do not correspond cleanly to personal authority. Titles such as acting, interim, or committee-based designations replace individual responsibility. A decision that would once have carried a name now carries a function. This is not an absence, that came earlier, but a displacement. Authority exists, but it is rooted through a structure that resists personalization. The action here is subtle, but concrete. Governance layers are added and reclassified at moments of heightened risk, while public-facing language remains static. The fortress is reinforced, but the facade is preserved. This contradicts the idea of continuity as an organic family process. Organic systems adapt gradually. These adjustments occur precisely when exposure increases. The consequence of this inconsistency is interpretive rather than dramatic. It forces a reevaluation of what legacy means in this context. If continuity requires repeated, technically precise intervention aligned with external pressure, then permanence is not cultural habit. It is operational discipline. The system does not persist because it is left alone. It persists because it is actively managed to appear untouched. This matters because it reframes earlier disappearances and alterations. Those were not isolated tactics. They were preparatory moves. By 1942, the structure is mature enough to absorb shock without changing its public posture. That is not the behavior of a family tradition. It is the behavior of a designed system. The inconsistency does not expose wrongdoing. It exposes priority. When faced with risk, the system chooses reinforcement over transparency. It chooses procedure over explanation. It chooses continuity over coherence. The record becomes a place where actions are legible only to those who already understand the architecture. This block advances the investigation by identifying the first moment where the myth and the mechanism clearly diverge. Earlier, the story and the structure could still be read together. Here, they part ways. The narrative continues to emphasize lineage. The documents emphasize control. The unresolved tension lies in accumulation. One inconsistency can be dismissed as coincidence. Several, aligned over decades, form a pattern, and patterns invite a different question, not about intention, but about inevitability. When the same adjustments recur under different pressures, at what point does continuity cease to be a story and become a project? The image that closes this inconsistency is precise and quiet. A 1942 governance instrument bearing an interim title, referencing an earlier reclassification, adjusting control without explanation. Perfectly valid on its own, yet impossible to reconcile with the idea that permanence here is simply inherited rather than engineered. After 1942, the inconsistency no longer appears as an anomaly tied to wartime pressure. It begins to repeat under calmer conditions, which is what makes it structurally significant. When extraordinary circumstances fade, but the same technical behaviors persist, coincidence becomes difficult to defend. The archive starts to show a pattern that is neither explained nor acknowledged, only maintained. In the years following the wartime adjustments, documents connected to the due Pont family continued to display a separation between declared identity and operational reality. Public-facing materials still frame continuity as a matter of heritage and long stewardship. Internal instruments, however, behave as if continuity were fragile, something requiring constant calibration. This tension is not resolved. It is simply carried forward. What sharpens the inconsistency here is scale. Small technical shifts, minor reallocations of authority, quiet extensions of fiduciary. Mandates, reappearances of committee-based sign-off, accumulate across documents that are otherwise unrelated. Each change, taken alone, appears administrative. Together, they form a rhythm. Control is repeatedly adjusted without ever being described as adjusted. The action that defines this phase is deferred explanation. When values or participatory rights shift, the record provides legal sufficiency but no narrative bridge. There is no attempt to reconcile operational change with public meaning. The system behaves as though explanation itself were a liability. This is not secrecy, it is minimization. The fewer interpretive hooks offered, the less can be questioned. The consequence is a widening interpretive gap. Observers relying on public narrative encounter stability. Analysts reading governance behavior encounter motion, slow, precise, and continuous. The two views cannot be reconciled without access to internal logic that is never fully disclosed. Permanence, once framed as cultural. Continuity now reads as a managed outcome sustained by recurring intervention. This extension matters because it reveals that inconsistency is not episodic, it is systemic. The same kinds of adjustments recur even when there is no immediate external threat demanding them. That undermines the argument that such changes are purely reactive. Instead, they appear preventative, anticipatory measures embedded into routine governance. Internally, this creates a quiet paradox. The more often the structure adjusts, the more it must insist, implicitly, that nothing has changed. Stability becomes something that must be continuously produced, not simply preserved. Over time, the language of legacy functions as a cover not for wrongdoing, but for effort. Continuity here is labor. This prepares the investigation for its next turn. When inconsistencies persist without resolution, they invite risk. Not the risk of exposure alone, but the risk that the system's own complexity will generate. Friction, points where the architecture no longer aligns perfectly with regulation, public expectation, or internal coherence. The next trace will not be about contradiction, but about consequence. The image that closes this extension is understated but telling, a post-war governance record that mirrors a 1942 adjustment almost exactly, filed under routine administration, offering no reason for repetition, confirming that what once looked like response has become habit, and that the inconsistency is no longer exceptional, but structural. The risk was understood long before it was openly discussed. In 1911, the United States crossed a psychological threshold. The country learned, publicly and painfully, to distrust systems that appeared too coordinated, too enduring, too insulated from consequence. Concentration itself became suspect. The lesson was not abstract. It was absorbed through headlines, hearings, and market reactions that demonstrated how quickly legitimacy could erode once power began to look planned rather than earned. This is the context in which the potential scandal must be read. If the full architecture surrounding the DuPont family had become widely legible, not merely visible, but understandable, the consequences would not have been confined to reputation alone. They would have moved outward in a predictable chain, touching media narratives, political alliances, and market confidence almost simultaneously. The first point of ignition would have been the press. Investigative journalism in the early 20th century had already learned how to translate technical arrangements into moral stories. Trusts, holding companies, and layered governance were not presented as neutral tools. They were framed as evidence of manipulation. A discovery that continuity had been deliberately engineered across generations through mechanisms designed to outlast scrutiny would have invited a reframing of success itself. What had been celebrated as industrial foresight could quickly be recast as structural advantage, quietly accumulated. That reframing would not remain rhetorical. Once the idea of power by design entered public discourse, political response would have followed. Legislators were already sensitive to accusations of regulatory capture and elite insulation. Hearings did not require proof of illegality to inflict damage. They required suspicion. Questions about transparency, fiduciary concentration, and the separation between nominal ownership and actual control would have provided fertile ground for intervention. Even the appearance of coordinated permanence could trigger calls for oversight. Markets, in turn, would have reacted to the uncertainty. Large systems depend on confidence, not only in financial performance, but in social acceptance. If governance structures began to look controversial rather than competent, counterparties would reassess exposure. Investors would question stability not because assets were weak, but because legitimacy was in flux. The cost of scandal is rarely immediate collapse. It is volatility, hesitation, and the slow withdrawal of trust. The action that reveals this risk is not hypothetical. It can be traced in how information is managed. Records are altered in tone. Disclosures are minimized without violating requirements. Language emphasizes normalcy, routine, and compliance. Potentially interpretive details are omitted. These are not the behaviors of an organization confident that its full story would be received benignly. They are the behaviors of a system calibrated to avoid narrative escalation. The consequence of exposure, had it occurred, would have been cumulative rather than singular. No single revelation would have dismantled the structure, but each layer of understanding would have increased pressure on the next. Journalistic inquiry would have led to political questioning. Political questioning would have produced regulatory attention. Regulatory attention would have introduced market noise. At every stage, the cost would have been paid not in fines alone, but in loss of control over meaning. This is why normality becomes the preferred posture. Normality deflects curiosity. It reduces the likelihood that technical arrangements will be read symbolically. When a system appears ordinary, its complexity is interpreted as necessity rather than intention. Silence in this context is not concealment, it is risk management. The risk of scandal also explains the persistence of earlier patterns. Disappearance, alteration, and inconsistency are not random artifacts. They are defensive adaptations. Each reduces the probability that an observer can assemble a coherent story that challenges legitimacy. The system does not need to hide its components. It needs only to ensure that they are never seen together. This block advances the investigation by clarifying motive without attributing malice. The avoidance of scandal is not presented as fear of wrongdoing being uncovered, but fear of reinterpretation. Meaning is the real liability. Once continuity is understood as engineered, it invites judgment about fairness, access, and influence, questions that no amount of legal compliance can fully neutralize. The unresolved tension lies in scale. The larger and more enduring a system becomes, the more catastrophic reinterpretation can be. A small fortune can survive suspicion. An institutional dynasty invites it. This imbalance explains the extraordinary care taken to appear unremarkable, even while operating at scale. The image that closes this risk is quiet but loaded, a carefully worded public statement issued in the shadow of scrutiny, affirming routine governance and long-standing practice, offering nothing new. Because nothing new is needed when the greatest protection is the absence of a story. What follows the recognition of scandal risk is not retreat, but calibration. Once a system understands the cost of being fully seen, it does not hide. It learns how to circulate without friction. In the years after the early lessons of public backlash and regulatory awakening, structures associated with the DuPont family show evidence of this calibration taking hold. The objective is no longer to prevent exposure entirely, but to manage the conditions under which attention forms. This phase is defined by anticipation. Governance behavior begins to move one step ahead of inquiry. Rather than responding to pressure, it adapts in advance of it. Reporting practices align closely with prevailing norms, even when internal complexity exceeds those norms by design. The system becomes fluent in the language regulators expect to hear, without allowing that language to describe its full operational depth. The action that characterizes this period is preemption. Potentially provocative elements are absorbed into broader categories before they can be isolated. Relationships that might invite scrutiny are reframed as standard practice. Affiliations are described in ways that emphasize dispersion rather than coordination. Each choice is small, defensible on its own, and collectively effective at preventing a focal point from emerging. The consequence is a form of reputational inertia. Once established, it becomes difficult for critics to gain traction. Investigations that rely on clear villains or dramatic disclosures struggle against a structure that offers only compliance and routine. Even when questions are raised, they dissolve into technical debate rather than moral confrontation. The system does not resist. It outlasts. This extension matters because it shows how risk management evolves into culture. Over time, participants internalize the principle that visibility must be managed as carefully as capital. Decisions are filtered through an unspoken test. Will this invite interpretation? If so, it is redesigned until it no longer does. This is not fear-driven behavior. It is professionalized caution embedded into process. Another effect emerges quietly. By avoiding scandal, the system also avoids narrative disruption. Markets prefer predictability. Political actors prefer targets that can be framed cleanly. A structure that resists simplification is less likely to be pursued aggressively. Ambiguity becomes a shield, not because it confuses, but because it exhausts. The cost of this posture is subtle but real. Innovation in governance becomes conservative. Change occurs only when it can be justified as continuity. This limits flexibility, but it preserves legitimacy. The system accepts constraint in exchange for endurance. That trade-off is not recorded explicitly, but it is reflected in the steadiness of form across changing environments. This prepares the investigation for its next stage. When risk avoidance becomes habitual, it shapes how actions are interpreted internally. Silence is no longer reactive. It is normalized. Procedures once designed to avoid scandal become standard operating assumptions. At that point, secrecy is no longer required because nothing feels exposed. The image that closes this extension is restrained and precise. A mid-century compliance filing that exceeds regulatory requirements in form while revealing nothing beyond them, indistinguishable from countless others, demonstrating that the greatest protection against scandal is not concealment, but the mastery of appearing entirely ordinary. By 1956, silence no longer needs justification. It has become a method. What once required deliberate omission now operates through standardized language that appears neutral, professional, and widely accepted. In the governance environment surrounding the DuPont family, power no longer hides behind secrecy. It resides inside words that sound administrative enough to escape attention. The date matters because it marks the moment when family wealth management across the American elite completes its transition into full professionalization. By the mid-1950s, the idea of a family office is no longer informal or experimental. It is a recognized logic of governance. Trustees, committees, and legal counsel operate within codified frameworks that treat discretion as standard practice. Silence is no longer exceptional behavior. It is the expected outcome of proper management. The normalization begins with vocabulary. Terms like fiduciary, stewardship, and governance appear repeatedly across documents without elaboration. Each carries moral and legal weight while remaining functionally vague. To describe control as stewardship reframes authority as responsibility. To label restrictions as fiduciary obligations transforms limitation into duty. Language does not merely describe reality, it produces it. This is not accidental. By 1956, governance texts increasingly substitute explanation with classification. Access to information is described as restricted, without clarifying to whom or why. Decisions are justified as maintenance of structure, implying continuity rather than choice. Oversight is framed as best practice, removing it from debate. The effect is concrete. Fewer people can question outcomes because fewer people are formally entitled to context. The action here is linguistic, but its consequences are material. When information is restricted by design, consultation becomes a privilege rather than a right. When authority is expressed as process, responsibility becomes diffuse. Committees act, but no individual appears to decide. Trustees administer, but rarely explain. The system functions smoothly precisely because it resists personalization. This normalization reshapes expectations internally as well. Participants no longer ask why certain details are unavailable. They learn which questions fall outside scope. Silence is not enforced, it is taught. New entrants adapt quickly, absorbing the implicit rule that good governance avoids unnecessary visibility. Over time, this produces institutional discipline without explicit instruction. Externally, the effect is equally significant. Observers encountering these structures see competence rather than concealment. Legal compliance is evident. Documentation is orderly. Terminology aligns with industry standards. There is nothing to provoke inquiry because nothing appears irregular. Power persists because it looks like administration, and administration rarely attracts scrutiny. The consequence of this normalization is endurance. Once silence is embedded in routine language, it becomes self-sustaining. There is no dramatic secret to uncover, only layers of process that explain themselves by reference to policy. The absence of narrative is reframed as professionalism. What might once have raised suspicion now signals maturity. This block advances the investigation by showing that the most effective concealment does not rely on hiding facts, but on managing meaning. When power is expressed through ordinary words, it loses the appearance of intention. It becomes background. The system does not need to defend itself because it does not appear to be doing anything at all. The unresolved tension lies in accumulation. Each term, fiduciary, restricted, stewardship, seems harmless on its own. Together, repeated over decades, they construct an environment where authority is insulated from challenge, not by force, but by form. The more normalized the language becomes, the harder it is to imagine alternatives. This prepares the transition to the final phase. When silence is fully normalized, it no longer appears as absence. It appears as order. At that point, the question is no longer how the system hides, but what remains visible despite everything that has been filtered away. The image that closes this normalization is quiet and precise. a 1956 governance memorandum invoking fiduciary duty to justify limited disclosure, professionally worded, fully compliant, leaving no trace of controversy, demonstrating that silence has become not an exception to governance, but its preferred expression. In 2020, the legacy no longer presents itself as a question. It presents itself as a fact. The name endures, the institutions persist, and the public narrative appears settled. Museums, foundations, cultural programs, and historical retrospectives offer abundant material about origins, achievements, and impact. What is notably absent is not information, but explanation. The modern investigation does not fail because records are missing. It fails because the records do not align into a coherent account of how continuity was actually maintained. This is the defining feature of the present. We live in an era of radical availability, digitized archives, searchable filings, public disclosures, institutional websites, transparency reports. In theory, following the trail of influence surrounding the DuPont family should be easier than ever. In practice, the opposite is true. The more material one encounters, the harder it becomes to identify the mechanism that connects it. The contemporary narrative emphasizes dispersal. Influence appears distributed across philanthropic boards, cultural endowments, educational institutions, and legacy organizations embedded within Delaware's elite networks. Each entity is documented, compliant, and publicly legible on its own terms. Annual reports are published. Missions are stated. Governance structures are outlined. Yet when the investigation attempts to move laterally, following how decisions propagate across these entities, the trail softens. The action that defines the present inquiry is methodological rather than dramatic. One attempts to reconstruct continuity by moving through records the way a modern researcher would. Corporate filings lead to foundations. Foundations lead to advisory boards. Advisory boards reference committees. Committees point to fiduciary frameworks. At each step, information is available, but access narrows. Language becomes more technical. References become circular. The system does not block inquiry. It redirects it into abstraction. This produces the modern form of opacity. Zones where information exists but cannot be integrated without prior knowledge of the architecture. Layers of intermediaries, legal entities, advisory vehicles, custodial arrangements, separate outcome from origin. Decisions are visible only as results. The reasoning that produced them is framed as internal. Process, protected by fiduciary norms and governance protocols that remain entirely lawful. The consequence is subtle but decisive. Public understanding of the legacy is shaped almost entirely by effect rather than design. The question of how fragmentation was avoided, how succession was standardized, and how governance adapted across generations remains unanswered, not because it is hidden, but because it is never framed as a question worth asking. The abundance of content creates the illusion of completeness. This is where transparency becomes performative. The system offers more information than any single observer can reasonably synthesize, while withholding the connective tissue that would allow synthesis to occur. Oversight bodies see compliance. Cultural institutions see benefaction. The public sees longevity. What no single vantage point reveals is the continuity of control as an engineered outcome. The present also reveals the success of normalization. Terms developed decades earlier, fiduciary duty, stewardship, restricted access, governance best practices, now appear unremarkable. They populate modern documents without friction. No alarm is triggered by their repetition. They are the expected grammar of institutional life. As a result, the mechanisms that once required deliberate construction now operate invisibly, embedded in professional standards. The unresolved tension today is not scandal, but comprehension. There is no singular secret waiting to be exposed. There is instead a structural silence that persists because it no longer feels like silence. It feels like order. The legacy remains intact precisely because it does not demand interpretation. It presents continuity as natural, even inevitable. while the design choices that enabled it recede into historical layering. This block advances the investigation by completing its arc. The present does not contradict the past, it confirms it. Every prior adaptation, disappearance, alteration, normalization points toward this outcome, a system so well integrated into institutional life that its continuity no longer appears exceptional. The mystery survives not as absence, but as overabundance without coherence. What remains unexplained is not whether the legacy continues, but how few modern narratives attempt to explain the architecture that made such continuity possible. That absence is the final artifact of the system's success. It does not need to defend itself. It does not need to hide. It only needs to persist within forms that appear entirely familiar. The image that closes the present is quiet and unresolved. A modern digital archive containing thousands of pages, mission statements, governance charts, compliance filings, each complete, each accurate, and yet collectively incapable of answering the simplest structural question without understanding the design that has guided them for more than 2 centuries. What becomes apparent when the present is examined more closely is that continuity no longer needs guardianship in the traditional sense. It is sustained by alignment between institutions that rarely need to coordinate explicitly. In 2020, influence associated with the DuPont legacy moves through channels that are culturally legitimate, legally routine, and socially insulated from interrogation. The system does not rely on secrecy, it relies on compatibility. The contemporary investigator encounters a landscape where governance structures mirror one another across domains. Philanthropic boards resemble corporate committees. Cultural institutions adopt fiduciary language indistinguishable from financial entities. Advisory councils circulate members whose roles overlap without ever appearing centralized. This repetition is not accidental. It creates interoperability. Decisions made in one sphere translate smoothly into another because the grammar of authority is shared. The action that defines the present phase is delegation without distance. Influence is exercised through participation in frameworks that are designed to operate autonomously. Once embedded, these frameworks do not require direction from a visible center. They respond to incentives, norms, and professional standards that have been stable for decades. Control persists because it is no longer personal, it is environmental. This produces a distinctive consequence. Accountability becomes diffuse without being absent. Every entity can point to its own procedures, its own compliance mechanisms, its own mission. Each is answerable in isolation. Yet the cumulative effect of their alignment, how decisions reinforce one another across institutions, remains largely uninterrogated. No single body appears responsible for continuity, even as continuity is unmistakable. The present also reveals a generational shift in perception. For contemporary participants, the architecture they inherit feels neutral. It is experienced as the natural order of institutional life rather than the outcome of historical design. This normalization is complete enough that even internal actors rarely frame their roles in terms of legacy preservation. They speak instead of governance, impact, and responsibility. The language is sincere, but it is also the product of long conditioning. From an analytical standpoint, this is the most effective form of insulation. When systems are experienced as normal, they do not attract scrutiny. When continuity is framed as stewardship, it does not invite questions about power. The present is not guarded by silence alone, but by shared assumptions about how institutions ought to function. This extension advances the investigation by showing that the endpoint of the system is not invisibility, but familiarity. The legacy persists not because it is hidden, but because it is indistinguishable from other respected forms of institutional organization. Its success lies in having become a template rather than an exception. What remains unresolved is whether this familiarity forecloses inquiry entirely or merely postpones it. Systems that appear natural often escape examination until conditions change. Economic stress, political realignment, cultural reevaluation. The present does not guarantee permanence. It demonstrates resilience under current norms. The final image of this extension is understated but revealing. A modern governance conference agenda listing panels on stewardship, fiduciary duty, and institutional continuity, attended by representatives from multiple sectors, no single name emphasized, no lineage discussed, illustrating how the mechanisms once built to preserve a dynasty now circulate freely as best practice, carrying continuity forward without ever needing to name it. The corridor grows quiet as the record closes. From Wilmington, Delaware, in 1802, where a name first attached itself to place and purpose, to the present moment where that name moves through institutions rather than individuals, the path does not read like chance, it reads like sequence. What began as enterprise became documentation. What documentation allowed became governance. What governance refined became normality. Doors were not forced, they were aligned. Ledgers were not erased, they were reorganized. And over time, the sound of control softened until it resembled administration. This is the institutional moral that lingers beneath the chandeliers and behind the paneled walls. Dynasties do not last by accident. They last by design. Not through spectacle, but through procedure. Not through dominance, but through stewardship language that reframes power as care. The most durable legacy is not the product, the name, or the founding fortune. It is the ability to convert wealth into rules and rules into habit until permanence no longer needs defense. Follow the chain back through the dust. An internal decision becomes a legal alteration. An alteration creates beneficiaries. Beneficiaries make certain presences unnecessary. Absences normalize. Normalization becomes culture. Culture becomes silence. And silence, once professionalized, no longer looks like concealment at all. It looks like order. That is why the truth suppressed here is not a scandal waiting to erupt, but a recognition that power works best when it appears to be organization. In the end, the archive does not shout. It closes softly. Documents are returned to their boxes. A trustee's memo is filed under routine. A corridor light dims. The mansion remains, intact, inhabited, and thoroughly documented. Yet the mechanism that carried it across centuries stays just out of frame. If you had to point to a single engine of permanence, trusts, trustees, reorganizations, or the quiet authority of stewardship, which seems most decisive to you, leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. And if this story resonated, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring. Again, subscribe so you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.